Hi, I'm Ralph Laughton and I'd like to show you a few things today when it comes to preparing wood. But before we do that, let's look at some of the things that you need to look out for when you're buying wood. Softwood does come pre-prepared, especially if you buy it from a DIY store or even a timber merchant. Most softwoods are supplied with a plain finish. Even though they're planed, they're not usually good enough for furniture grade. Now they may look okay when you see them. Before you apply any finish, you'll find that the machine marks will be accentuated and you'll wish that you'd spent a bit more time on it in the first place. Although sanding will eradicate some of those marks, it will never totally eradicate it. And the easiest thing to do is to just run a plane over it before you start. The other thing is to be selective. If you're going to use softwood to build anything other than a framework, then you need it to look nice. And a piece of wood like this piece of wood I've got in my hand here is exactly what you don't want. It's full of dead knots. It's not very attractive, and it's not going to do the piece any good at the end of the day. Some people say that knots give it character, but it's a personal thing and I prefer not to have the knots. But that's your typical piece of softwood. Now I'm not going to labour too much on this because it's the hardwood that we really need to discuss. So let's put that to one side and let's look at a few bits of hardwood. First of all, these are all offcuts. These are usually the bits that have come off the end of a board where I've used them for something else. Boards like this come a bit of paint on the end in an attempt to stop them splitting. This piece actually doesn't look too bad. It's probably only been cut off because the board was too long. More often than not, I'll cut defects and things out of boards. This one again doesn't look too bad, but when you actually look at the end of the timber, you'll see it's got a massive cup in it, and that may well have flattened itself out further down the board, so I've taken my dimensions from the other end of the board. We will run a plane over some of those in a minute just to show you what you can do, but you have to remember, if the board is cupped, then by taking a piece out of the centre of it, you're going to lose quite a bit of thickness. You know, you can get down to that from there if you're not careful. By using shorter lumps of board, you can eradicate any twist, or at least minimise it. If the board was 6 foot long and you tried to flatten the whole thing, you could end up being 1/4 of an inch out from one corner to the other. If you only need to use a board 2 foot long, then cut it to 2 foot or a little bit longer, and then flatten that piece and flatten the next piece as you go. That way you'll get the best use out of the board. Sometimes you'll find that the board comes much nearer where you want to get to. This piece of beech is as sold as sawn, but is obviously dimensioned and is pretty much where you want it to be. There's very little work in that, and when you look down its length, there's hardly any twist or bow in the board itself, so you'll get quite a bit of thickness out of that with minimal finishing. Finally, if we machine a board, it doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, bring it up to the finish that we need for furniture, or any project for that matter. This board has been machined, and you can still, in certain lights, see the rippling that is put on it as it goes through the thicknesser. You can actually, on this particular board, you can feel the odd little nick in it where there's a nick in the blade of the machine. So although this has been dimensioned, It just needs a very light touch with a plane to bring it up to a smooth finish. Finally, this is a piece of board that had been finished completely and at a later date was resawn to bring it down to a thickness for another project. This side of the board was perfectly dry. This side of the board had retained some moisture, being the centre of the board. It was originally that thick. So as this has been sawn and left open to dry, this has now shrunk and is now bowed. So although this has got a nice smooth finish on it, this will need refinishing again, and again we're going to lose some thickness. So I'd have to flatten that and then thickness this side to match that side to bring it down to a reasonable thickness. Now you can also see from this piece of board that the rings, the annular rings, are covering quite a large area of the board, and that's why this board has cut as much as it has. Ideally you could just rip that board down the middle, or even off to one edge, and flip that piece of board over so that you then had rings going that way and then rings going that way. And although you would still get a ripple, instead of having a curve over that area, you'd have an S, which would be much less noticeable. An interesting point here is that this board has cupped in the opposite direction than you'd expect it to cup. It would normally cup against the rings, but because this side of the board was dry and this side was the inside of the board, it was still damp, it's gone the opposite way. So it really depends how the board was dried. This was dried in two stages, one as a thick board and then one once after it had been resawn. So there's no hard and fast rules to follow here. You just have to look at what you've got and then work with it.